I have a question. So if you're against US intervention in other governments, does the US have the right to decide for Ukraine's future by calling the peace? Do you realize that Ukrainians at occupied territories are oppressed and tortured every day? I'm saying that because my hometown is occupied right now, and I know of the war crimes that have been committed from the first hand. And do you not believe that other conflicts can deteriorate if Russia gets away with what they've done? And in 1994, Ukraine gave up their third nuclear power in the world in exchange for guarantees from Russia to recognize its sovereignty. And Russia has invaded Ukraine in 2014. They broke out the war in Donetsk, and US also attempted to negotiate that through the Minsk. However, all the attempts failed. Do you not believe that other peace call will be broken again by Russia?
What you're repeating is the official propaganda line. Now let's look at the facts, which you can find out. Let's start with 1994. There was an agreement. Ukraine abandoned its nuclear weapons. Then something happened. After that, Bill Clinton violated the agreement between President Bush #1 and Gorbachev, in which Bush #1 promised not unambiguously, very clear. You can look at the documents. There's been a lot of deceit about them, but you can find them. National Security Archive on the web. Unambiguous promise that if Gorbachev agreed to let Germany be unified within a hostile military alliance, NATO, quite a concession if you look at history. Agreement was if Gorbachev agreed to that, the United States pledged not to move 1 inch to the east of Germany. Firm, definite promise. Okay, in that context, Ukraine, part of Russian Federation, gave up its nuclear weapons. Okay, then Clinton violated it. Very soon moved to incorporate former Russian satellites up to the Russian border within NATO. We think of NATO as defensive. The world knows differently. It's an aggressive, violent military alliance. That's very clear from its record. So it moved NATO up to the Russian border, installed heavy weapons on the Russian border. At that point, the Russian decision to allow Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons, the whole story was abrogated. Well, what happened then? For the last 30 years, almost the entire high-level US diplomatic corps, including current CIA Director William Burns, his predecessors, George Bush's the second Secretary of Defense, hawkish Robert Gates, Reagan's ambassador to Russia, Jack Matlock, George Kennan, famously. Just about anyone who knew anything about Russia was harsh, practically the whole US political class, right to left, including hawks like Paul Nitze, have been warning the United States government that it's reckless and provocative to violate the commitment not to extend NATO to the Russian border, and particularly dangerous to violate what all Russian leaders have called the red lines. Yeltsin, Gorbachev, Putin, Medvedev, all of them, Ukraine and Georgia, which are right at the core of the Russian heartland, not to violate that by demanding that they be part of an aggressive military alliance. Well, let's take 2014, and it got worse. The second Bush dismantled the ABM treaty, It's a very serious threat to Russia that puts major weapons on the Russian border aimed at Russia. Remember, the United States has tactical nuclear weapons aimed at Russia a couple of miles from its heartland. ABM treaty expanded, dismantling the treaty expanded that. Go into the details. Bush II also invited Ukraine to join NATO. Well, that was vetoed by France and Britain, France and Germany, but US power overwhelmed it, so it stayed on the agenda. Everyone understood, the whole high-level US diplomatic corps, that this is something no Russian leader would ever accept, Ukraine as part of a hostile military alliance. You look at history, look at the topography, open plain right to Moscow, St. Petersburg. No Russian leader is ever going to accept that. Well, then comes the 2014, what's described in the United States, the way you described it. But what actually happened happens to be rather different. Sorry if you don't want to listen to it, maybe others do. What happened is that there was an elected president of Ukraine, Yushchenko. He was overthrown in a coup backed by the United States. Okay, you can say, I like the coup, I didn't like the coup, it doesn't matter, but it is a coup. Of a coup which overthrew the elected president, who was more or less sympathetic to Russia, replaced him by, he called for, he said, let's have another election. Coup leaders rejected that. There's a lot of violence, mostly from the coup leaders, if you look at it. The new government that was installed banned the Russian language, took militant anti-Russian positions. In the Donbass region, most of the population is Russia-oriented. They objected. They didn't want to be part of it. There was a proposal, an international proposal, the Minsk agreements. These are not, it was mainly led by France and Germany, Russia and Ukraine, but it was an international agreement. UN Security Council voted unanimously for it, including the United States. That's the Minsk agreements. Ukraine maybe tried to observe them. The US was opposed to it and didn't get anywhere. Zelensky, when he was elected, tried to move in that direction and was threatened by right-wing forces. US wouldn't back him, he backed off. Up until a few weeks before the invasion, February 2022, Russia was calling for implementation of the Minsk agreements, which called for Ukrainian neutrality, not part of NATO, kind of like Austria during the Cold War, actually kind of like Mexico today. Mexico can't join a hostile military alliance. If it tried, we'd blow it away. Okay, so it's neutral. So Ukraine would be like that. The Donbass region, Eastern Ukraine, would have a degree of autonomy within a Ukrainian federation, something like Switzerland or Belgium. Up until a couple of weeks before the invasion, the Putin government was still proposing that. US is not having it. Ukraine, I think under US influence, rejected it. Then you get the invasion. Does it justify the invasion? No, it's an act of criminal aggression. It's a crime, as I've said over and over, rather like the US invasion of Iraq, though nowhere near as serious. The Stalin-Hitler invasion of Poland, these are acts of aggression. It doesn't, whatever provocation there may be, it doesn't justify them. But we can't ignore the record of what happened up until the invasion. Well, even after the invasion, there were negotiations. Last March and April, there were negotiations between Russia and Ukraine under Turkish auspices. According to Turkish sources, they were getting somewhere. The Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, flew to Kiev, informed Zelensky's government that the US and Britain thought this is not a good time for negotiations, were opposed to it. He was followed by Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense. The media aren't interested in these things, so nothing's reported. We know about it mostly from Ukrainian sources. But presumably Austin gave his usual message, public. No end to the war unless we severely weaken Russia. In any event, the negotiations broke down. Well, is there a possibility of negotiations now? Only one way to find out. Try. If you're opposed to trying, of course, there's nothing. Well, that's not the whole story. There's much more. But on both sides, plenty of things to say. But I think that's a pretty accurate broad brush account. And you have to consider that when you ask the kinds of questions that are being asked about Russian crimes and terror, which is certainly real. It's a horror story, undoubtedly. The longer the war goes on, the more it'll get worse. And notice it's not just Ukraine that's suffering. Ukraine has probably by now lost most of its army. It's now fighting with reserves, newly recruited soldiers. The Pentagon has conceded that the US is directing the advanced equipment that's being used, HIMARS and so on, all leading to the possibility that Russia may escalate to the US style of war, Iraq style, shock and awe type war. Meanwhile, there's plenty of others suffering from this. There's a good reason why virtually the entire global South, that's most of the world, is calling for a negotiated settlement. Good reason why the majority of the population in Germany, population, not the political class, population, large majorities saying we have to move towards a negotiated settlement. There's a lot of people suffering from this. In the global South, people are suffering seriously from the deterioration of grain and fertilizer exports from the Black Sea region. It's causing massive starvation. There is the constant threat of escalation to major nuclear war. Probably the worst effect is that the continuation of the war has reversed the limited steps that were being taken to try to deal with the heating of the environment, which is going to destroy us, and not in the distant future. Reverse these efforts. Now there's opening up new regions for oil exploration for generations ahead in the United States and Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Huge profits for the fossil fuel companies, for the munitions companies. They love it. Racing on to destruction. All of this happens as long as the war continues. There are good reasons why a large majority of the population of the world is calling for moves to try to settle it before it gets worse. Okay, you can think about it. And if you want to look at the history, which you should, look at it accurately, not just what you hear from US propaganda. There's plenty of documentation about it.